Hello and welcome. In this mini lecture, I'm going to be talking about women and their place in early Christianity and the early church. And before I start into this topic, let me emphasize how incredibly rich and challenging this topic is, and that this mini lecture, while hopefully provocative and informative for all of you, is certainly not going to be exhaustive. This is one of those topics that I can't possibly do justice in the small place that I have available. Let me also say this is a topic I have a lot of interest in. Among other things, this topic has been incredibly rich in the study of Christianity, especially in the last 30 or so years. And it happens that this is a topic that was in much of its formative period while I was going through grad school in the midst of all of this. As you'll also gather as I go through some of this later material, this also is close to a lot of the work that my wife does as well. So it's a topic that I've thought quite a lot about and also have pretty extensive knowledge of. All right, all of that said, let me emphasize from the beginning that this is still an open-ended topic. While we have some sense of a consensus amongst scholars in exploring this issue, in summarizing it, this is still very much an ongoing issue, an ongoing topic of conversation. All right, so let me start with something that hopefully is not so very surprising to most of you, and this is the place of women in the Gospels. Of course, one of the joys of a class on the New Testament is that we've had the luxury of spending some real time in these Gospel stories. And one of the things that is very striking as we move through these individual Gospels is how incredibly prominent women are in Jesus' ministry. And this, of course, is true from the very beginning of his ministry to the very end. And so, for instance, in the Gospel stories, we see this emphasis especially on the Virgin Mary. We see this particularly, for instance, in the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus' story begins with this remarkable birth with the Virgin Mary. We also see this in the Gospel of John, where Mary, the mother of Jesus, challenges, encourages Jesus to perform his first miracle at the wedding feast at Cana. And of course, women especially prominent at the end of Jesus' ministry. And so women, the people who are there at the cross when everyone else has failed Jesus and abandoned him, women also going to the empty tomb to care for Jesus' body. And women who now Jesus first appears to, particularly in this wonderful story in the Gospel of John, when Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. So women now are used to tell the story of Jesus, especially in the beginning and the end. Well, what do we see throughout his ministry? What we see here is, again, a surprising number of women. Women that Jesus is constantly encountering and interacting with. Women who Jesus heals, women who Jesus converses with, women who Jesus stands up for, such as, for instance, the woman caught in adultery that we see in the Gospel of John. And often these interactions, at least for people of this period, would have been truly scandalous. That Jesus now defending a woman caught in adultery. Likewise, we get in the Gospel of Luke a story of a woman caring for Jesus while he's at table at a house of a Pharisee, kissing his feet, a sinful woman overcome with her own sin now, and engaging Jesus in this very intimate way. We see also Jesus interacting with women that were very unacceptable from Jewish perspectives, such as the woman, the Samaritan woman at the well that we get in the Gospel of John. Again and again, Jesus is interacting with women, interacting with them in ways that are really problematic from a Jewish and from an ancient perspective. So women are present throughout Jesus' ministry from the beginning to the very end, and surprisingly present, much more than we might expect for a story telling now about an important, famous Jewish prophet, a figure who is thought to be the Messiah by these Christian authors. Now, also, and let me add a little bit more subtlety to this, because one of the things I have the joy of teaching is women and the Bible. And I can tell you that these individual gospel stories, which hopefully you appreciate some of their distinctiveness, some of their individual beauty, this is rarely clearer than when we look at women and how women are portrayed in these individual gospels. And what we see is these individual gospels now, part of what is built into their message and how they see Jesus is how they present his interactions with these women. And what we find there is pretty fascinating, pretty startling. So let me give you some examples. So the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark, remember, is a story in which the disciples really don't come off so well. Again and again, the disciples and other people close to Jesus don't seem to understand who he really is. Of course, this is closely linked to this idea of the Messianic secret. Again and again, they misunderstand, misrecognize, including figures like Peter. And what's so surprising, what's so startling in the Gospel of Mark is that women do get it. That again and again in the Gospel of Mark, women are presented as people who understand who Jesus is, understand what his ministry is, and who have surprising faith and surprising insight, especially in contrast to the men who surround the stories. Well, we turn then to a story like Matthew. Matthew, again, perhaps a little less interesting, but women again take on a slightly different role. And so, for instance, it's fascinating to see things like Jesus's reinterpretation of the law in places like the Sermon on the Mount. And what do we see? But as Jesus reinterprets the law, it shifts the place and role of women. So, for instance, when the emphasis is no longer just on adultery, but instead is on lusting after your neighbor's wife, suddenly this becomes something that is really puts demands on both parties, both men and women equally. And if anything, even puts more emphasis in some ways on men and their need to control their own desires. We see in Luke a surprising number of women. Luke, this is one of the things that many modern Christians love about the Gospel of Luke, is how many women show up and how much attention is put into stories of women. And on the one hand, scholars looking at this have recognized that these are wonderful stories. Without Luke, for instance, we would not have all these amazing stories about Mary, the mother of Jesus. We wouldn't have lots of our most beloved stories about women. The challenge in Luke is that we see women who are surprisingly in the midst of Jesus' ministry, who Jesus interacts with in shocking and astonishing ways. While he interacts with them, that following these interactions, what happens is women are placed in more traditional roles. This is not necessarily a bad thing, depending on your perspective. It could be good or bad, depending on how you want to read or interpret these. But what is striking in Luke is that these women who are often in vulnerable positions, challenging positions, encounter Jesus, and Jesus's healing or care for them allows them to then step back into traditional expected roles within the family, within their surrounding communities. And this is going to be true in the Gospel of Luke, also in the book of Acts. Gospel of John is again going to have women in very prominent places. With John, what is surprising is both how long these engagements are with women, where Jesus is talking to them for very extended periods. And we see this in a number of places, such as the Samaritan woman at the well, such as the interactions with Mary and Martha, such as this climactic interaction with Mary Magdalene following the resurrection. And in each case, there are extended conversations between Jesus and these women. And these women are surprising conversationalists with Jesus, and they seem to understand Jesus and what he's teaching in ways that many of the figures don't. And so women in John seem to be models in many ways of faith and insight when challenged by Jesus. So what does this say all in summary? What do we see about women in the Gospels? We see women surprisingly prominent throughout Jesus's ministry, and we see them mostly treated in very positive ways in these gospel stories, and in ways that are frankly surprising, given the surrounding culture and cultural expectations. If, as biblical scholars often assume, These are stories written by men, written for an audience that is very heavily guided by men. This is a man's world within the Jewish and Greco-Roman world. Then these women are surprisingly present and surprisingly positive. Well, what do we see then as we move away from the Gospels and the stories of Jesus into Paul and Paul's letters? Well, what we see in Paul's letters, and especially if we first limit ourselves to these 7 letters that we are convinced are definitely by Paul, is that women again are surprisingly prominent. Paul, we reconstruct as scholars the life of his communities based on these letters and the glimpses we get into them. And what we see is women in positions of surprising prominence and authority. Women are often directly named in his letters, and they seem to be very prominent in these communities. So, for instance, Philippians, this warm, loving letter that Paul writes to this community, encouraging but also giving them direction, we only get a handful of named people, including these 2 women, Euodia and Syntyche. Now, granted, they seem to be in some struggle with one another. Paul wants them to unite and to set aside their differences, but clearly they are prominent enough, important enough, that Paul is concerned about them. These are 2 women who are important enough in this community that their division is causing challenges, causing problems that Paul then needs to address. So clearly they have a lot of influence within this community. We also, in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he's again going to be worried about significant women. And granted, this is a community that's got tons of problems. And these women are just some of the midst of these. And the bigger problems tend to have to do with leadership, with gifts, with other issues. Romans, fascinating. Here we get this massive work now, Paul's masterwork, and sent to this community, sent as his calling card to prepare them for what he teaches. And what we see is that Paul now drops lots of names, both at the beginning and especially at the end of this letter. And women are surprisingly present. From the very beginning, he has entrusted this letter, entrusted it with Phoebe, who is a leading person now at Cenchreae, and he has sent her with this letter to deliver it to this Roman community. That Paul has entrusted it with a woman to deliver, a woman who is recognized in a position of leadership, is already striking. This is, after all, widely considered Paul's single most important letter, entrusted now to a woman. Moreover, especially when we get this list of people at the end, we see now this incredible list of women who are, again, described often in very brief terms, but these brief terms include some pretty surprising designations, particularly with what women later become within the tradition. And so, for instance, he's going to describe people like Junia as foremost among the apostles. He's going to describe Priscilla and Aquila, this husband and wife team, placing the woman first ahead of the man, which is very surprising. Particularly, again, these are very formal, how you do these things. Woman placed first, clearly a reference now to her importance. And this husband and wife ministry team now mentioned repeatedly throughout Paul's letters, and how important they were to him, how important they were for the church. He also is going to describe a woman as a deaconess. Again and again, he's describing these women, important, prominent positions. Well, Acts. What do we see in the book of Acts? Again, we see women playing very prominent roles. And one of the best examples of this is Lydia, this figure now again from Philippi. Paul encounters her, and her conversion, as well as the conversion of the people in her house, where she's now going to have a house church. This is a decisive moment for the transformation of now this community in Philippi and the creation of this church. And Lydia is going to take her wealth, this wealth as a purple dyer, and she's going to take her wealth now to support Paul, a relationship that we see reflected in the letter of Philippians. And this model of women converting and then converting their whole household and having a dramatic influence on their household and the people around them, this is going to be a common trope that we're going to see again and again in these early writings. We'll also interestingly see it all throughout later Christianity. Many of the most prominent men of Christianity throughout its long history are actually going to be converted by women in their lives. And this seems to sometimes have been done intentionally by the church. One of the things they would do if they wanted to convert a prominent man was to match him up with some good Christian woman who would help convert him. Well, this also raises an interesting question, and this is this issue of house churches. Again, remember that Paul's earliest communities, where are they meeting? They're meeting in houses. And this, of course, these are these Roman houses in these large cities, I should say Greco-Roman houses. There's going to be both Greek and Roman influence. And they're going to be meeting often in prominent, wealthy members' houses where they now have an opportunity to gather together. And within both Greek and Roman houses, who really ran these houses, who was in charge of the day-to-day internal running of these houses, it was especially women. This was their area of control, their purview. And this now is very interesting because if, after all, houses are where these earliest churches are, it shouldn't surprise us that women who are bringing this community into the space are now going to have a very prominent role, a significant role in these early communities. Well, another interesting feature to think about with Paul with this is that how does this tie with other parts of Paul's thought? And particularly when we think of Paul's theology, it again shouldn't surprise us that women should be so prominent. Paul, after all, is emphasizing that these distinctions, these worldly distinctions that matter so much, are irrelevant when it comes to this new Christian world, this new Christian worldview. When one looks to the cross, looks to the resurrection, that all of these distinctions of Jew or Greek, of male or female, free or slave, all of these are meaningless, all of these pass away. And so in this radical vision of equality, at least in relationship to the Christian message, this would imply that male and femaleness don't really matter, that they aren't that significant. This also is interesting in relationship to this other huge aspect of Paul's thought, namely this apocalyptic thought. If the world is going to end, if the world is about to be transformed in some radical way, then on the one hand, you don't have to challenge these inequalities. You don't have to challenge the societal problems or distinctions that may exist in the Greek and Roman world, whether that has to do with free or slave, whether that has to do with Jew or Greek, male or female. But also, these divisions now, these distinctions really just don't matter. They don't matter in light of what is happening, of what is to come. And so with this apocalyptic mindset, this distinction of male and female in positions of prominence in leadership likely wasn't so important. They weren't that interested in these traditional distinctions. Nor, and this is going to be very important for what's going to come next, were they necessarily interested in fitting in the larger world. Paul was perfectly happy to cause problems in these communities. He was obedient to authorities and emphasized the importance of that obedience to authorities. He also was very happy to make people upset with him. This is how he's constantly getting thrown in prison. And Christians clearly weren't very good or didn't choose to fit in the Greco-Roman world. And this now fits again very well with this apocalyptic mindset. If the world is changing, why should you bother to fit in? Focus yourself on the things that really matter. Focus yourself on living the Christian life, on living in this transformed way, directing yourself towards the cross, towards the resurrection, and all the rest of the stuff is irrelevant. All right, so Paul's communities, again, what do we see? We see women in positions of surprising prominence throughout the letters that we are certain are by him. This accords well with what we saw in the gospel stories, where again, with Jesus, women were surprisingly prominent. So what happens? What happens in the later tradition? Well, what happens is there's this effort now in these later writings to claim Paul and to claim Paul's thought. And as Christianity in these later generations, particularly starting around the end of the first century and later, Christianity, this apocalyptic urgency, the fire of this urgency, begins to fade a bit. It doesn't disappear. It's always going to remain a part of Christianity, and it's always going to keep coming back within the tradition. But this white hot urgency that we see in Paul's letters like 1 Thessalonians, this now is going to fade, and Christianity is going to get more organized. We're going to see this some within leadership structures, especially with things like bishops, deacons taking on far more prominent roles. What had been a much looser style of organization in Paul's letters that depended heavily on itinerant ministers who would come briefly to town, give guidance and direction, and then leave things in the hands of this local community that seemed to share this very flexible style of leadership that may have started to include house church leaders and deacons, but all of these terms are still very fluid during this early period. Well, these become much, much more fixed. And especially 100 is used by scholars as a very, very firm date for bishops, for instance. Bishops emerge as the leaders in the church. And this, by the way, is going to continue all the way till the present day. The highest rank within the church is truly bishops. One bishop in charge of each city or each region. And this idea goes back especially to the figure of Ignatius, writing shortly after 100, arguing for the idea of one bishop over each community. Indeed, even a figure like the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, the Pope originally is understood as the Bishop of Rome, the foremost bishop amongst equals. So all bishops are understood as equals within the tradition. Bishop of Rome is just slightly more equal than others within the early tradition. Of course, over its long history within the Western tradition, the Bishop of Rome becomes more and more the Pope over time. And this is going to happen through this history of the late antique and medieval tradition that I'm happy to tell you lots more about if you ever want to know more about it. It begins as early as First Clement. It's going to continue all the way through this later tradition. There are lots of interesting reasons for it. So bishops become the leaders starting just after 100, and you get a very clear structure of hierarchy under them. And this hierarchical structure becomes a major part of the church. Well, one of the things that happens is this earlier, more fluid style of leadership in which women had prominent roles becomes problematic. It becomes a challenge to what is developing as a very clear formed structure in which men are clearly the leaders, and that is very hierarchical. And we can see now this struggle over the place of women within this tradition and within earliest Christianity. And this struggle now is going to go back to this question of Paul and Paul's authority. And we're going to get writings now within the tradition that argue for directly opposite positions. And so best examples that we have of these are these two very different writings, both of which you've now read, 1 Timothy and the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And 1 Timothy is going to be the place where it is stated most forcefully, although it's certainly going to echo things we're going to see in some of these other writings, particularly writings from this period. 1 Timothy is going to emphasize that women have a very clear and very particular place. And this is going to be especially in this extended treatment in chapters 2 and 3. And women's place, according to 1 Timothy, is, and I'm going to paraphrase here, so I apologize, please do go back and read it because the precision of it is very important. But 1 Timothy is going to emphasize that women's place is to be silent, particularly in public, to be submissive, and submissive to the male teachers and male authority, that women are not allowed to teach. that women should focus, especially again in public, on modesty and not drawing attention to themselves, and that women now are responsible, that women are, first of all, easily led astray, easily deceived, just as Eve was back in the story of creation, and that women are prone to sin and temptation. That Eve now, it is her fault what happens. And it's interesting to see the de-emphasis here of Adam in this particular account. Eve now is blamed for it, and that women are all a part of that. That women are caught up in essentially the sin of Eve, told in the second story of creation that we get now in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. And because of this now, women are problematic or challenging, and women must be limited in their roles. Interestingly, it's going to conclude with this image now that women are to be saved in childbirth. This idea that may seem very strange to many of us, and should feel strange compared to what we've seen in Paul. And for instance, Paul's advice towards sexuality back in things like 1 Corinthians, where he talks about marriage and virginity, for instance. So 1 Timothy gives one very particular view. We get a very different view in Acts of Paul and Thecla. And the Acts of Paul and Thecla, this non-canonical text that ultimately doesn't make the cut, very, very influential within the tradition. Thecla now much beloved by women in early Christianity, as seen in this naming pattern of the prominence of the name of Thecla for Christian women. Also, you can see it in some of the imagery. So for instance, we get later icons to Thecla. We get this amazing piece from Ephesus, from a 4th century shrine with an image of both Paul and Thecla together. And we get things like sarcophagi with Thecla envisioned in the midst now of her suffering and her trials that she's going to undergo. And what we see in the Acts of Paul and Thecla is another stream of thought, and it's one that we see in a range of writings within Christianity. It clearly is a prominent part of the tradition. We get a whole number of non-canonical acts that are going to emphasize the importance of virginity. So virginity now is essential in embracing the true Christian life. And this is, of course, at this core of teaching in the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And as Paul comes to town and teaches about virginity and the joys of virginity, this is much of what Thecla now falls in love with and embraces. Thecla is going to embrace this life of virginity, and she's going to embrace it at great personal cost and great threat to her life as they now try to burn her at the stake and as she then flees town. Paul, of course, fascinatingly in this account, doesn't receive her, doesn't allow her to receive baptism because of her youth and beauty, fearful that she's not going to be able to hold to her virginity. An idea that we see echoing perhaps some of the passages in 1 Timothy and this concern about widows. Despite that, Thecla is allowed to follow him, and we then get this wonderful account of her struggle again with a male and his attentions that leads to her being thrown to wild beasts in the arena. And this remarkable story of her miraculous survival in the midst of this, as well as her baptism of herself. She's convinced that she's going to die. By the conclusion of the story, she and Paul meet again and part ways with Paul supporting her in her ministry and her desire now to go and spread the Christian message. And so what we get by the end of the story is Thecla's remarkable faith in the midst of her trials, her clinging to her virginity, and that she, together with Paul now, is seen as, in many ways, his equal or his fellow spreader of the Christian message. We get later stories, by the way, of Thecla remaining for long life. She ultimately retreats to a cave where she's going to continue. There are interesting stories late in her life of men who come and try to sexually violate her. Again, she is miraculously preserved and her virginity remains intact through her death. Now, what's interesting with these stories of 1 Timothy and the Acts of Paul and Thecla is we see this struggle within the tradition of questions of marriage and virginity. And this is going to be a very interesting struggle throughout the long history of Christianity, but it's rooted already in this early period. So as the tradition becomes more structured, more hierarchical, and what we see in 1 Timothy, but also in lots of the writings from around the period 100 to 200, is we see an emphasis on Christians being married, this desire for them to live married, and that marriage now creates stability for the community, a stability that is especially essential for Christian leaders. And marriage is clearly the desired form for all Christians. This is how you're supposed to live. Now, in some ways, this, of course, accords with Paul in 1 Corinthians, this idea that if you can't restrain yourself from desire, then you should become married. You should be married. Because at least within marriage, these desires now will be acceptable. But, of course, what does Paul emphasize in 1 Corinthians? He wants people, if they can, if they have his gift, to remain virgins. That this chastity helps one to focus their attention on the Christian life. And chastity, perhaps not the best word. I should mention, by the way, all of these sexual words and sexual language, very, 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 very complex, both in Paul and also in the context of the ancient world, although that's a whole nother topic. What's interesting is that in this period, 100 to 200, what we see within the tradition and what we see in this rich survival of patristic writings, early church fathers, is that both marriage and virginity are parts of the tradition. They are rich parts of this tradition. And let me move to our next slide, I believe, as we start talking about this and the church fathers. And so what we see in the writings of these church fathers is that, yes, this tradition of 1 Timothy is taking hold. It's becoming authoritative within the tradition. This idea that the people who are married, this is the correct path for Christians. This is the correct path to ensure good order in the community and to keep people from sin. But there's clearly a tradition of virgins, and especially women who have embraced life as virgins and dedicated themselves to God and to Christ. And these women who are virgins are very prominent within the tradition. Of course, this may be familiar to you in part with this later tradition, especially, for instance, in Western Catholicism, of nuns. Think of these early women who are virgins. They're kind of like super nuns, if you will. These women who are widely acknowledged and visibly, very easily visibly perceived as people who have dedicated themselves to Christ and to God. And they have prominent roles both within the community and even within worship. And what exactly those are is not always clear, but we can see within these early church writings of these early church fathers concerns about some of the problems of their role and their influence and their leadership, particularly as the church is moving instead to this model of marriage and hierarchy. We get lots of writings referencing this and talking about them. One of the most sustained ones and one of the most interesting is this piece by a very important early church father, Tertullian, who writes on the veiling of virgins. And in this writing, he's concerned with limiting the role of these virgins who are so prominent in these church worship services, and he wants them to draw less attention to themselves. Interestingly, they're so embedded in the tradition that he can't argue that they're not important. He can't argue that they shouldn't take these vows, that they shouldn't live these lives, but he doesn't want them distracting from the traditional leadership in the community, and he wants them to be fulfilling more traditional roles, especially within this worship setting. And it's interesting for him, writing around 200, that this is still clearly a huge issue, and a huge issue despite writings like 1 Timothy and what it is that they're arguing for. This is clearly a huge debate and a complex issue within the early church tradition. Well, what's going to happen is over time, and especially as people cite 1 Timothy and cite Tertullian, and by the way, again and again within the tradition, this is what people are going to cite. This is the text that theologians, that church leaders are going to again and again cite in defense of their position, limiting women's roles, limiting women's positions in leadership and authority over men. Well, despite that, women are going to continue to be important in the tradition. And we see that throughout its long history. So this is just a few kind of highlights. Women are not allowed to be priests. Women are not allowed to be church leaders. And that's going to be clear already, certainly by the 4th century, if not earlier. They're going to not be in those positions. And some of this may have to do with this struggle between orthodoxy and heresy. Because one of the things that we're going to see is that in some of these movements that get labeled as heretical, women are in surprising positions of authority. Figures like Mary Magdalene are going to be seen as super apostles. They're going to be seen in particularly positive ways. Likewise, we're going to see women prophetesses, for instance. The Montanists are a fascinating example of this. 3 women prophetesses, Priscilla, Quintilla, and Maximilla, these 3 interesting women. We're going to see women as leaders, perhaps in some of these Gnostic movements, and women talked about in particularly positive ways within these communities. And the Orthodox community is going to set itself in opposition to this, again, citing 1 Timothy, citing Tertullian. Well, despite them not being in roles as priests, women are going to be in roles of surprising power, often within the tradition. One great example of this is in this image here, Helena, the mother of Constantine. Constantine, of course, the first Christian emperor, responsible for supporting the church, for ending this extended period of martyrdom, and personally supporting the church financially in a way that radically transforms the place of Christianity. Helena, his mother, is absolutely at the center of it. She too is going to take her personal money, dedicate it to the church. She is almost single-handedly going to transform the Holy Land. And she is going to go in pilgrimage to the Holy Land. She is going to establish these major early Christian sites. She is also the legendary discoverer of the true cross. She gets associated with the true cross that you see imaged here. And Helena becomes this amazing figure within the tradition, widely admired, widely revered. Well, we're going to have all sorts of other amazing women in the tradition. We're going to have Augustine the Great, for instance. Where would he be without his mother in the background, encouraging him, introducing him to Christianity? And that is going to be true again and again within the tradition. Likewise, many of these early Christian kings who convert, kings like Clovis, for instance, kings in Great Britain, King at Isle of Wight, for instance, all of these are going to convert. They're going to be married to good Christian wives. And this is going to help now in their process of conversion. And this seems to be very intentional within the tradition. I should also mention, this actually goes back a little bit earlier, pre-Constantine, that there are an astonishing number of women who are martyrs that are huge in the tradition. Martyrs in the early tradition are the heroes of the church. They are the ideals that are looked to, and many of them are women. And what we see with some of these women, including this amazing martyrdom of Perpetua, a woman's diary and account of the story of her martyrdom. Perpetua, again, and here we have this woman being martyred. She now is going to be surprisingly influential in her community. That what you see in this martyrdom account is all of these men looking to her for guidance and direction. She, through dreams, through visions, is going to give them insight that they all accept, that they all immediately accept as authoritative. So clearly, women still in important positions, stretching through this early period, despite 1 Timothy, despite writers like Tertullian. Well, what's going to happen after Constantine is, particularly as martyrs, as people aren't dying for the faith anymore, the new heroes of the church become monks. Monks especially figures like Saint Antony that we have here. The life of Antony written by Athanasius. Antony becomes this cause for this huge celebrity figure. The life of Antony that Athanasius writes becomes the bestseller of its day. Everybody's reading this. Everybody's falling in love with this ideal of monasticism. These stories of mostly men who now war against Satan in their own bodies, struggling against Satan in trying to limit the desires of their flesh. And of course, these desires take many forms, but one of the common forms they take in these accounts is that of women tempting them. And so Antony, for instance, has these visions of women, demonic figures that are tempting him with desire. And this becomes typical in this later monastic tradition. And so as monks, and especially male monks, become the ideal, celibacy now is the ideal for all Christians, and especially for Christian leaders. And of course, as I'm guessing many of you know, Catholic priests are required to be celibate. Likewise, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition in Christianity, while there's both married and celibate clergy, many of the most important roles tend to be restricted for celibate clergy. This idea, by the way, in the Western tradition in the Catholic Church grows gradually. It develops out of this monastic tradition, and it's not until quite a bit later, it's not until the Gregorian reforms in the 11th century, that it is required for priests to be celibate, that it becomes a required part of the tradition. Well, even though monks become the ideal and celibacy becomes the ideal, especially for Christian leaders, and the ideal for what it means to be the Christian, to live the Christian life, women are going to remain important in the tradition. And for instance, in both Western and Eastern Christianity, we're going to get especially prominent women who still have embraced these lives of virginity. So the female counterparts of these male monks are often surprisingly influential within the tradition. And so we get a huge number of these figures. We get figures, especially women who are mystics, women who write these amazing devotional pieces of literature inspired by the Holy Spirit that are seen as absolutely central in the tradition. We get figures like Hilda of Whitby, we get Hildegard of Bingen, Catherine of Siena, amazing, amazing women. Catherine of Siena, a particularly fascinating one. She's actually proclaimed a doctor of the church. This is a doctor of the church, a very rare title within the Catholic Church. It refers to one's authority, particularly in regards to theology and church teaching. There are not very many doctors of the church in the whole history of the church, so to have a woman among them is pretty astonishing. She's also just a fascinating, fascinating figure. Catherine of Siena, responsible for getting the Pope moved back to Rome, and her influence in doing so, a remarkable part of this medieval story of Christianity. She's also fascinating for all sorts of other things. This image, and I didn't want to creep you out, which is why it's as small as it is, this is from the church dedicated to Catherine of Siena in Siena. And I was actually there just very recently, so this is very vivid for me. This connects to a rich part of the tradition that I'm guessing is very strange to many of you, namely this issue of relics, this collecting of the remains of the saints. And this, by the way, it may seem very, very strange, particularly to some of you who may know modern Christianity, especially modern Protestant Christianity, but the remains, the relics, the bits of the saints, this is huge, going all the way back to the beginnings of the tradition. Back as early as the martyrdom of Polycarp in 155, we see the relics being collected, the bits of the saints. And we have all sorts of inscriptions of early Christians being buried, wanting to be buried next to the saints, next to their remains, so that the holiness of these saints will influence and shape them. 1 second reminder here. Well, these relics, they're absolutely central in the tradition. Every early Christian space that is founded over the remains of the dead, remains of these sacred figures. And every altar has some part of their remains. They're collected within the tradition. Of course, these get challenged. The theology surrounding these gets challenged, particularly by Martin Luther and later. But they are absolutely central in the tradition. This comes up with Catherine of Siena because what is this in the center here? This is actually her head. This is her skull that is at the center of this. There are also bits of her arm bones as well that are preserved. These pieces that don't decay, don't get removed. And relics, a fascinating part of this tradition, including relics of some of these female saints as well as male. All right, all fascinating stuff, maybe disturbing or creepy to some of you. But let me fast forward now to modern Christianity. And what we see in modern Christianity is that this is one of the most debated, struggled with aspects within the tradition. Women who have been such a vital part of Christianity throughout its long, long, long history are within some parts of the tradition held in positions of limited authority. Others, it's more negotiated. So, for instance, certain parts of the Protestant tradition, women now serve as ministers, serve as priests. Catholic Church, clearly they do not, nor do they in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And in some, especially of the more conservative Protestant traditions, they're going to want to keep women in more limited roles of leadership or be more uncomfortable with women in prominent roles. And these issues now are rooted in the long, long, long history of this tradition. And part of why these texts are so fascinating, and part of why, for instance, texts like the Acts of Paul and Thecla, 1 Timothy, the authority of a figure like Paul, this long history is so rich and so important to understand in the midst of these debates, and these debates of what the church should look like in the future. What should the tradition look like? And this is very much an open-ended question. Well, one more piece to add for perspective, and I'll try to keep this extremely brief because my time has already partially run out, but it's too fascinating not to share a bit of it. And this is this question of ancient context. As we talk about women in the early church, one of the things that scholars often do is look to the socio-historic context and say, what was the role of women within Judaism? What was the role of women in the Greco-Roman world? And one of the suggestions that scholars often put forward, and particularly biblical scholars, is they'll often say, well, the Greco-Roman world, the Jewish world, were extremely limiting of women. And so Christianity now, when it comes along, it offers a radical freedom for women, particularly in contrast to these rival traditions that it's in relationship with. And that ultimately Christianity is going to go back to be more like these traditions. That when Christianity goes the direction, say, of 1 Timothy, it's going to be more acceptable in the Greco-Roman world and in the Jewish world. And in some ways that is fair. In some ways that's a fair statement. Certainly in the Greco-Roman world, in the Jewish world, there was a lot of discomfort with powerful women. And they certainly would have seen Christianity more acceptable if it was maintaining more desirable, more traditional roles. But to suggest that women weren't in positions of power and influence, and that Christianity was this wonderful new thing, unlike these traditions, would be misleading. These traditions are much richer and more complex than people tend to assume. And just as women were prominent in early Christianity, there seemed to have been prominence of women within these other traditions. So, for instance, women in Judaism. There's been wonderful work done on this, again, that was going on, that I was very much in the midst of in my own graduate work. So, for instance, Ross Kramer, a person who was in the midst of my grad training, she was a professor, friend, colleague in the midst of it all. She was a very important voice, especially for women and Judaism. And her work, particularly Maenads, Martyrs, Matrons, and Monastics, this incredible source book that collects these sources of women in positions of influence and authority. And often these are very scattered sources. Likewise, this early work by Bernadette Bruton on women leaders in the ancient synagogue, where she looks especially at the evidence of inscriptions. What do we find? But we find astonishingly women described as arches synagogae, leaders of the synagogue. This, if you know anything about later Judaism, should be as astonishing to you as any of these discussions of Christianity, that women seem to have been leaders, at least in some of these communities, and prominent leaders in ways that left physical evidence. And we're going to get women in surprising positions. Of course, in the Greco-Roman world, we go back, in the Greco-Roman world, we're going to see women again in positions of surprising authority and influence. And we see this especially women fulfilling religious roles. So we see women serving, for instance, as priestesses of certain gods, goddesses, usually female goddesses, sometimes serving in roles with male gods as well. Also serving other important roles. And one of the most famous, of course, is the Vestal Virgins that you see here. Particularly important role in Roman religion, maintaining the hearth, central now in maintaining this religious relationship with the gods on behalf of all the Roman people. So clearly virgins who are very important, interesting for our earlier discussion. Also women now with these incredibly important influential roles. The Vestals are also interesting because while they serve for an extended period, these women carefully chosen from the leading families, their virginity carefully watched over, they then later in their life, they can retire from their role. And they're going to maintain a very prominent role in Roman society, where they're going to have special seats set aside for them at theatrical performances. They're going to have a clear influence in Roman society, an influence that is challenging for the Roman world, that is very male dominated, and that is constantly an issue they're trying to negotiate. Likewise, we're going to see women, particularly from prominent families, wealthy women, often using their money, using their power. And this is going to be especially true of widows. Women, sometimes women who are married, whose husbands perhaps give them a little more room to exercise their power, but especially women who are widows. Depending on their relationship, they could actually control their own money, control their own estates, and they did so quite ably. And they often wielded significant power and influence. So, for instance, here we have a woman who used her money to dedicate, particularly with the council hall, the city of Aphrodisias, the city that I wrote my dissertation on. She now honored with this life-sized, gorgeous statue right outside of the city council hall. Here we get one that's perhaps even more interesting for us because it combines these worlds. And this is Scholastikia. She now dedicates a bath complex and does so in the city of Ephesus, right off of the main road. So here she, as a Christian, a wealthy Christian woman, dedicates this, and she now is honored with this elaborate inscription underneath her statue, honoring her. So, ancient world, were women limited in their roles? Absolutely. And when they got to have too much power, they became a challenge, they became a problem. But despite that, they did exercise significant influence. And there are lots of exceptional, remarkable women within both the Jewish and the Greco-Roman world. And so, especially these earliest Christian women, such as women in Paul's communities, they certainly would have fit within this world and this larger context. They are unusual, but not unheard of within this larger tradition. All right, incredibly rich and complex issues. I have way overextended my time, so I will stop there for now.